welcome everyone. My name is Laura Brogan and I'm the National Phonics and Early Reading Lead at Twinkl. This is the Curriculum and Assessment Review update for Phonics and Early Reading, and also the government response. So I always like to start any CPD with why this, why now. So we're just going to talk about, what the Curriculum and Assessment Review is. It's now been published, and alongside that, the government have published their official response. There's quite a lot to digest, 197 pages, I think, which I'm sure as educators, it is, it's quite difficult to find the time to digest all of that information. So that's why we're here at Twinkl, and that's why I'm here today, to support you in unpicking the review and the government response, to make sense of it, think about what it tells us, highlight what matters most, and that is particularly for phonics and early reading today. So over the next 30 minutes, we'll break down the headlines, and I will be offering kind of some clear reflection points throughout for you to consider, and what you might start thinking about straight away from what this means for you and the pupils you serve. So the Curriculum and Assessment Review was an independent examination of the curriculum and assessment system across primary, secondary and 16 to 19 education in England. And in July 2024, the government commissioned Professor Becky Francis to convene and chair a panel of experts to conduct this review. So it was very recently published in November 2025 and supported by a government response. And it's, the first review of the curriculum in over a decade. So it was at that point where it's really important to look at what that's telling us. So it drew on research, sector feedback, and a call for evidence from thousands of educators and experts. So for today particularly, we are going to be focusing on the parts of the review that concern most directly to early reading and phonics. So there are some key headlines in relation to phonics and early reading. The review and the government response do send out a very consistent message about phonics, not much in the way of change, but a really focus remaining firmly on securing early decoding, noticing those at risk of falling behind, and inclusive assessment and transitions. So we're going to focus on the key headlines today in relation to that. And I thought I would just pop this quote on here, just because it's kind of at the beginning of the curriculum and assessment review, and it really kind of sets the scene and underpins what the message is and what the recommendations are for phonics and early reading, and how that secure foundation is so important to support other areas of the curriculum. So the first thing we're going to think about that the Curriculum and Assessment Review recommends is that phonics remains the cornerstone of early literacy. So this isn't new, but it was really strengthened throughout the Curriculum and Assessment Review. So respondents to the call for evidence have praised the role of phonics in teaching early literacy, and the government have reaffirmed its commitment to systematic synthetic phonics, and they expect all primary schools to use a systematic synthetic phonics programme and to keep up to date with the necessary training and resources. In the government response, this particularly calls out how they will require SSP programs to give schools the tools and training to identify pupils at risk of falling behind and act early to give them extra support. So, the main kind of theme around the SSP programs for them is to be able to give schools that tools and training to identify those pupils at risk of falling behind in that intervention. The reflection point I've put on here is maybe for you to consider where your phonics practice is strongest right now. Is it in identifying those pupils at risk of falling behind and acting early to give them that extra support? The next headline we're going to think about, which links to this, is the phonics screening check, and the phonics screening check will remain. It is described as broadly working well, and it's said that it will continue. So the government have set an ambition for this, and that is that 90% of children meet the expected standard in the phonics screening check by the end of year one, through an improved focus on the children that struggle in the earliest years. So again, thinking about those pupils at risk of falling behind. So that's remaining the same, but the focus is really shifting to support and training to help deliver on that ambition of 90% to meet that expected standard. So again, the reflection here is, what does that 90% phonics screen check success mean for your context? Because in their response, the government addressed that some schools already achieve this, and they will be supporting more schools to achieve the same. So what does that look like for you? Also in the government's response, they talked about new training and development for the reception teachers, which will collectively help deliver that ambition, alongside expanded support for children with SEND to access phonics and improve their reading. So that, there's recommendations in place to support meeting that ambition for 90% of pupils to meet the expected standing in the phonics screen check by the end of year 1. So again, linked closely to the phonics screening check, the Standards and Testing Agency will explore assessment approaches for pupils that currently struggle to access that check. So that's going to explore alternative assessment approaches for non- and pre-verbal pupils to ensure that their progress is recognised at this critical stage. So this is a notable step, and it tells us that progress in early reading must be visible and valued for every learner, even where traditional assessment routes are not suitable. So again, maybe a reflection point here is, what does that currently look like for you? How do you currently record progress for pupils who can't access that phonics screen check? And how is that progress measured in a slightly different way? The next key headline talks about stronger identification and support for children at risk of falling behind. This is something that, again, links to all of those other headlines, particularly the first one about phonics remaining a cornerstone of early literacy, but that focus really coming onto those pupils and a risk of falling behind and noticing those earlier. So it really tells us that there's a sharper focus on early identification and targeted intervention. And again, the messaging around that is that SSP programs must equip schools with the tools and training to notice risk earlier and take action immediately. Something else from the government response was that the government said they are going to expand and double the reach of their reading ambition for all CPD programme, particularly to support pupils with SEND to access phonics, recognising that these pupils may need smaller steps and more time to develop fluency. And I think, that smaller steps and more time is something to really think about what that looks like currently for those pupils with SEND. So my reflection point here is, how quickly does assessment lead to action for these pupils currently? And what does that look like, and how can we improve that? And the main key headline is it's about continuity beyond Key Stage 1. So the review does highlight concerns that too many young people fall behind in secondary education. It raised how strong teaching and a well-designed curriculum in the primary phase plays such a vital role in establishing the foundations in English. However, not all pupils complete Key Stage 2 with the secure foundations needed for that confident progression. We are seeing that students entering Key Stage 3 without these strong foundations often struggle to build up momentum in their learning, and then subsequently and unfortunately begin to fall further behind. So this really highlights the need for that kind of coherence and that transition, responsiveness and support at the point of transition, particularly from Key Stage 2 to Key Stage 3. So the expectation here is that those early reading foundations must be built on in Key Stage 2 and Key Stage 3 so that every pupil is supported as they transition. In the government's response, they addressed that weaknesses in reading are the most critical to be resolved in the first years of secondary school, as the fundamental skill that enables children to access and engage with the entire curriculum. And, reading is that fundamental skill to enable pupils to access the curriculum, in that much wider sense beyond English. Reading is required to access lots of elements of the curriculum. And we know from research that it also impacts on life chances. So the government response said that they will provide all secondary teachers with access to new reading training from January 2026, and this plans to reach at least 75% of secondary literacy leads by the end of the 2025 to 2026 academic year. And also with the introduction of the Year 8 reading test, and all of these things kind of coming together to support that continuity beyond Key Stage 1 and address those gaps in secondary as early as possible. So again, the reflection point I've put on here is about what information travels with pupils as they transition between year groups. And, you know, even if you're in the primary phase, that's still so important, those transitions from you know, different key stages as well, and how that will then support getting towards the end of Key Stage 2 into Key Stage 3. So for phonics and early reading, in terms of what's changed, if we kind of step back from those headlines, you can really see how each of those really link together and form that clear pattern emerging. And it's not about introducing something entirely new. It's about changing the way that we work with what we already have. So to summarize those major changes, it's that move from retrospective assessment to proactive assessment habits. So instead of, you know, waiting for phonics screening check outcomes to confirm, you know, if pupils are behind in their expected standard of reading, using some, you know, building routines basically that help teachers notice risk earlier, and, you know, identifying those pupils that are at risk of falling behind and intervening. So more of that keep up approach rather than a catch up approach. There's also a much stronger emphasis on early identification. So again, linking to that, it's really, you know, relayed in the curriculum and assessment review that we do that. Key change is around inclusion. So assessment being meaningful for every learner is significant, and the Standing and Testings Agency exploring those alternative assessment approaches along with the DFE for pupils who cannot access the phonics screening check is real recognition that progress in early reading should be valued for all pupils. And again, that expectation for transition and continuity. So highlighting the concern around pupils reaching secondary school without secure foundations tells us that these early reading foundations need to be protected right through primary, Key Stage 1, Key Stage 2, and supported at Key Stage 3, so these gaps don't emerge later on. So we've looked at the key headlines. And for phonics, compared to maybe some other subjects, there's, you know, it's about that kind of reflection and kind of tightening what we've got in place. But you could kind of think about some practical things to prepare for that. So particularly around auditing your current phonics practice, taking into account what that looks like for assessment. Thinking about those pupils that are at risk of falling behind, thinking about how progress is recorded for all learners, and also considering how that information on pupils transfers at different transition points. So again, is there something from that list that you might start to action straight away to be able to best prepare for the recommendations from this review? So we would like to talk a little bit about how Twinkl can support schools and educators in responding to the priorities we've discussed today. You may already know that Twinkl Phonics is a fully structured and DFE validated systematic synthetic phonics. It supports early identification through that assessment. And we do have a level 1 that focuses specifically on early phonological and phonemic awareness and supporting children before that formal grapheme teaching kind of begins. And it is designed to support reading progress beyond the phonics screening check, going to the, level 6, goes to the very end of year 2, starting to build on decoding, blending, and develop more fluency, incorporating more spelling and grammar as well. And there is also a Key Stage 2 intervention program, which is Decoders, which is more age appropriate for these older pupils. And alongside this, the Rhino readers play a real crucial role in application. They are fully decodable books, carefully matched to the phonics progression as is recommended in the reading framework, so pupils are always reading text that they can successfully decode. So, these resources really support those key messages of the review and secure foundations, noticing risk early, and ensure that progress is sustained over time. So, we're very proud to be able to support with that and kind of evolve as we see the recommendations from the review come out. Something else that might be quite useful is this CPD events calendar, and particularly schools that are a Twinkl Phonics school, the ones that say Twinkl Phonics next to them are more appropriate, but there are lots of sessions that aren't for Twinkl, you know, not necessarily for Twinkl Phonics schools. There's one that I am doing in March, which is called A Place for the Phonics Screening Check, and how should we assess early reading? So we've talked quite a lot about the Phonics Screening Check here, and, you know, in the calls, for the analysis of the call for respondents, there was different things raised about the effectiveness of the Phonics Screening Check, although that will still remain. That is more of a TeachMeet session to kind of discuss the Phonics Screening Check and those and how that looks for assessment.